Attorney Marcus Whitfield, a black defense lawyer in Atlanta, stood calm in a courtroom where he was underestimated because of his skin color. Representing a factory worker forced into unfair short-term contracts, Marcus uncovered hidden agreements and proof of corruption. With discipline and undeniable evidence, he turned doubt into respect and secured justice for the workers. His victory proved that integrity is stronger than prejudice. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? And if you believe some heroes are willing to look guilty to save the innocent, this story is for you. Atlanta woke beneath a pale gray sky, the early autumn air cool but not yet cold. A light breeze moved between the glass towers downtown, rustling fallen leaves along the wide steps of the Fulton County Courthouse. Traffic hummed in steady waves, and news vans were already parked along the curb, their satellite dishes tilted toward the clouds as if waiting for something dramatic to descend from the sky. Inside the courthouse, Attorney Marcus Whitfield stood near the tall windows overlooking the city. At 38, Marcus carried himself with a quiet authority that did not demand attention but held it once earned. He was tall, just over 6 feet, with a lean, athletic build shaped more by discipline than vanity. His deep brown skin contrasted sharply against the crisp white collar of his shirt. His hair was cut short and neat, his jawline clean and deliberate. His dark eyes, steady, observant, were the kind that missed very little. Marcus had grown up in a modest neighborhood on the west side of Atlanta. His father, a bus driver, had once been wrongfully detained in a labor dispute when Marcus was a boy. That memory, his father standing humiliated but dignified, had quietly shaped Marcus's life. He learned early that justice was not automatic. It had to be insisted upon. Across the hallway sat James Carter. James was 45, broad-shouldered but slightly stooped from years of factory work. His hands were large and rough, scarred in places from machinery. His skin was a deep mahogany tone, and faint lines framed his eyes from years of worry. He wore a borrowed navy suit that fit awkwardly across his shoulders. His short-cropped hair showed the first signs of gray near the temples. There was strength in him, but today it was buried beneath uncertainty. James worked at Coal Manufacturing, a major supplier of industrial components on the outskirts of Atlanta. For nearly 6 years, he had signed rolling 3-month contracts, each one promising temporary stability but never long-term security. When shifts slowed, employees were dismissed without notice. No benefits, no insurance, no compensation. He had signed because he needed to feed his family. Now he feared retaliation. "They've been calling," James muttered quietly, his voice low and uneasy. "Supervisor says maybe there won't be a position for me after this." Marcus met his eyes. Retaliation is illegal, and today we begin proving that. James nodded, though the fear did not leave his expression. The courtroom doors opened. Judge Harold Whitman presided from the bench. At 62, Whitman was tall but heavy-set, with thinning silver hair combed carefully back. His pale skin showed the weathering of age and long hours under fluorescent lights. His sharp blue-gray eyes were known for their sternness. He had built a reputation for strict order and firm authority. Many described him as fair but uncompromising. Others whispered that his fairness depended on who stood before him. When Marcus rose for his opening statement, the room felt heavier. Across the aisle sat Richard Cole, CEO of Coal Manufacturing. Richard was in his early 50s with a broad build and carefully groomed salt-and-pepper hair. His tailored charcoal suit fit him perfectly. His expression was composed, almost bored. Years of wealth had taught him how to sit comfortably in any room. Beside him was the company's attorney, Thomas Reynolds, a sharp-faced man in his 40s with narrow eyes and an easy smirk that suggested confidence bordering on arrogance. Marcus began clearly. "Your Honor, members of the jury, this case concerns systematic exploitation through short-term labor contracts designed to avoid lawful responsibility." Judge Whitman interrupted almost immediately. "Mr. Whitfield," he said, adjusting his glasses, I trust you intend to focus on verifiable facts rather than rhetoric. The interruption was subtle. The tone was not. Marcus inclined his head slightly. Of course, Your Honor. But the pattern continued. Each time Marcus laid foundation for his argument, Whitman interjected, questioning phrasing, narrowing scope, suggesting procedural caution in a manner noticeably sharper than when Reynolds spoke. In the gallery, reporters scribbled. Local media had framed the case as ambitious. Some called Marcus a rising attorney attempting to challenge a corporate giant. Others questioned whether he had the experience to handle a case involving a multi-million-dollar company. Marcus ignored the cameras. He outlined the structure of the contracts, 3-month rolling agreements that reset before benefits eligibility could activate. Employees cycled indefinitely through temporary status, some for years. When production slowed, layoffs required no compensation. Meanwhile, company filings reported fluctuating workforce numbers inconsistent with testimony from workers. James shifted nervously when called to the stand. Under oath, he spoke slowly. They told us it was standard, said if we didn't sign, there were plenty of others who would. Reynolds stood for cross-examination. His voice was smooth, almost casual. Mr. Carter, you voluntarily signed these contracts, correct? James hesitated. I needed the job. That wasn't my question, Reynolds pressed. Marcus objected. Judge Whitman paused before allowing Reynolds to continue. Each pause felt longer than necessary. Each glance from the bench carried unspoken doubt. Outside the courthouse, Elena Whitfield stood near a news van, arms folded tightly against her chest. Elena was 36, tall and slender with warm, caramel-toned skin and intelligent brown eyes. Her long black hair was tied into a neat low bun. As a high school history teacher, she was patient by nature, steady in crisis, and deeply observant. Years earlier, she had faced subtle discrimination in her own career, being mistaken for support staff instead of faculty more times than she could count. It had sharpened her resilience without hardening her kindness. Today, she watched headlines scroll across her phone. Whitfield takes on corporate giant. Ambitious or overreaching? She inhaled slowly. Elena believed in her husband's brilliance, but belief did not erase worry. At home, 12-year-old Naomi Whitfield sat at the kitchen table with her laptop open. Naomi was slender, like her mother, with expressive dark eyes and tightly coiled hair pulled into a puff above her head. She was observant, thoughtful, and far more perceptive than most adults realized. She had inherited her father's calm gaze and her mother's empathy. She refreshed a news site and read a comment aloud, softly. Does he even have the experience for this? Her brow furrowed. For the first time, Naomi recognized something uncomfortable. The world did not see her father the way she did. Back in the courtroom, Marcus continued carefully. He introduced early documentation, copies of contracts and employee schedules. Each exhibit required meticulous foundation. Judge Whitman scrutinized every step. Proceed cautiously, Mr. Whitfield, the judge warned at one point. This court will not entertain speculation. Marcus did not flinch. Understood, Your Honor. What the room did not yet know was how much Marcus had already uncovered beyond those papers. But today was not the day to reveal everything. Today was about establishing the framework, about planting seeds that would later bear undeniable proof. James stepped down from the stand, looking smaller than when he entered. During recess, Marcus approached him. You did well, Marcus said. James rubbed his palms together. Feels like they already made up their minds. Marcus glanced toward the bench where Judge Whitman reviewed notes in silence. Sometimes, Marcus replied quietly, it takes time for truth to feel heavier than assumption. Outside, Elena watched as Marcus exited briefly for air. Their eyes met across the plaza. No words were exchanged, but understanding passed between them. This was not just a legal battle, it was a test, Inside, reporters whispered about courtroom tension. Some speculated whether Marcus had bitten off more than he could chew. Others wondered if the judge's interruptions signaled skepticism about the case itself, or about the man presenting it. When court adjourned for the day, Judge Whitman addressed the room formally. "Proceedings will resume tomorrow morning." His gaze lingered on Marcus a fraction longer than necessary. As the courtroom emptied, Marcus gathered his files slowly. James lingered nearby, uncertain but grateful. Atlanta's sky had darkened by the time Marcus stepped outside. The breeze had cooled further, carrying the scent of rain not yet fallen. This was only the beginning, and the glare from the courtroom bench had made one thing clear. Marcus Whitfield would not only be fighting corporate misconduct, he would be fighting perception itself. The rain that threatened the evening before finally arrived overnight, washing the streets of downtown Atlanta in a thin, reflective sheen. By morning, the city felt quieter, the sky low and silver, as if the clouds themselves were pressing down on the courthouse steps. Marcus Whitfield arrived early, briefcase in hand, his expression sharper than the day before. If Chapter 1 had been about perception, today would be about structure. Inside his office, located on the 12th floor of a modest brick building near Peachtree Street, Marcus spread the contracts across a long oak conference table. The room was simple but orderly. Dark wood shelves lined with legal volumes, framed degrees on the wall, and a single photograph of his father standing proudly beside an old city bus. The air smelled faintly of paper and coffee. He adjusted his glasses and leaned over the documents. 3 months. 90 days. Renewal clause. Termination without cause. No health coverage. No retirement contribution. No long-term classification. Each contract was nearly identical. The language was carefully crafted, neutral on the surface but calculated underneath. Workers like James Carter were technically temporary, yet many had been cycling through these contracts for years. By resetting the term every 90 days, the company legally avoided triggering obligations for full-time employee benefits. It was precision exploitation. Marcus marked several sections with yellow tabs. He traced the reporting data attached to the case file, quarterly employment disclosures filed with state authorities. The numbers did not match the employee rosters James had provided. The company reported fluctuating workforces that conveniently dipped below thresholds that would require expanded benefits contributions and higher payroll tax classifications. The pattern was too consistent to be accidental. Later that morning, court resumed. Judge Harold Whitman entered with the same measured stride, his robe flowing neatly behind him. His expression remained controlled, almost distant. When Marcus presented his breakdown of the contract structure, he spoke carefully, methodically. "Your Honor, this agreement appears compliant at first glance. However, when renewed consecutively for extended periods, it functions as a permanent arrangement without permanent protections." Whitman leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Whitfield, are you suggesting the structure itself is unlawful or merely unfavorable?" Marcus did not hesitate. "I am suggesting that its repetitive use is designed to circumvent statutory responsibility." The judge's eyes narrowed briefly. "That is a serious assertion." "Yes, Your Honor, and it is supported by reporting discrepancies." Across the aisle, Thomas Reynolds objected smoothly. "Speculation. My client operates within all regulatory guidelines." Whitman allowed the objection in part, instructing Marcus to confine himself strictly to documented evidence. The skepticism remained. After adjournment, Marcus returned to his office rather than home. He needed confirmation before advancing further. He was reviewing tax classifications again when a soft knock sounded on the open office door. The man standing there was unfamiliar. Daniel Brooks appeared to be in his early 30s, tall and slim, with sandy blonde hair parted neatly to one side. His complexion was fair, his jaw clean-shaven, and he wore a tailored gray suit that suggested corporate affiliation. His blue eyes carried a cautious alertness. He extended his hand. "Daniel Brooks," he said quietly. "I work legal compliance for Atlantic Industrial Systems." Marcus recognized the name. Atlantic Industrial was a competitor to coal manufacturing. Daniel remained standing even after Marcus gestured toward a chair. His posture was slightly tense, shoulders straight but hands clasped tightly together. It was the stance of someone weighing risk. "I shouldn't be here long," Daniel said, "but you're looking at contracts. I believe you're only seeing half of them." Marcus's gaze sharpened. "There are 2 sets," Daniel continued. "One internal template for workforce management. Another version structured for regulatory filings. I've seen similar tactics before. If Cole is doing what I suspect, there will be discrepancies between operational contracts and filed documentation." "Why tell me?" Marcus asked. Daniel hesitated. "Because my father worked temporary labor his whole life. He retired without health coverage. No one ever questioned the paperwork. I went into corporate law thinking I'd change that from the inside." His mouth tightened briefly. "Turns out, change doesn't move easily." Or, he slid a folded sheet of paper across the desk, an outline of how dual contract systems were often structured. "I'm not accusing anyone," Daniel said carefully. "I'm suggesting you verify internal versus filed versions." Marcus studied him for a moment. Daniel did not appear reckless, he appeared conflicted. "I appreciate the direction," Marcus replied. "But understand if this proceeds publicly, your name cannot be protected unless you testify." Daniel's expression hardened slightly. "I'm not ready for that." Marcus nodded. "Then we proceed carefully." Daniel left as quietly as he arrived. That evening, Elena Whitfield stood at the front of her classroom at Benjamin Hayes Middle School. She wore a soft burgundy blouse tucked into a charcoal skirt, her posture upright but relaxed. Students had long gone home. Tonight was a parent engagement meeting she had organized to discuss community support and student resources. Elena believed education was more than curriculum, it was environment. Among the parents seated in folding chairs was Patricia Gomez, a petite woman in her early 40s with olive-toned skin and dark hair pulled into a tight bun. Patricia's hands were calloused from factory work, her fingernails short and unpolished. She wore a plain navy sweater and jeans, her shoulders slightly hunched in habit. Years earlier, Patricia had immigrated from Mexico with her husband, seeking stability. What she found instead was relentless overtime. During open discussion, Patricia raised her hand hesitantly. "My husband works at coal manufacturing," she said softly. "Many workers are scared. They say if anyone speaks, contracts won't be renewed. They tell us we're replaceable." The room grew quiet. Elena felt a weight settle in her chest. She kept her tone steady. No one should feel replaceable. Patricia nodded, eyes glistening. "Some want to help your husband's case, but they're afraid." Elena understood fear. She had watched it shadow Marcus's clients before, but she also recognized the cost of silence. After the meeting, Elena stepped outside into the damp night air and called Marcus. "There are more workers," she said. "They're just scared." Marcus listened, his office lights still glowing behind him. "Fear keeps systems intact," he replied. "But patterns break when enough people step forward." The next morning in court, Marcus introduced preliminary employment data comparisons. He did not yet reveal the possibility of dual contracts. Instead, he focused on numerical inconsistencies, quarterly reports that listed fewer active workers than payroll logs suggested. Judge Whitman examined the documents with measured skepticism. "Correlation does not imply misconduct, Mr. Whitfield," he stated. "Businesses experience fluctuation." "Certainly, Your Honor," Marcus answered evenly. "But consistent underreporting across consecutive cycles warrants examination." Reynolds objected again. Whitman allowed limited questioning, but withheld broader conclusions. James Carter watched from his seat anxiety visible in the tension of his shoulders. Every objection felt like a barrier, yet Marcus remained composed. During a recess, James approached him. "Do they even hear you?" he asked quietly. "They hear," Marcus said. "They just haven't decided to listen." Outside the courthouse, rain clouds finally thinned, allowing narrow shafts of sunlight to break through. Reporters noted the judge's restrained responses. Commentary remained divided. Some suggested Marcus was building something methodical. Others claimed he was reaching. Back inside, Whitman concluded the session with a firm reminder. This court will require clear evidence of intent, not inference. Marcus gathered his files slowly. Intent would require proof beyond numbers. As he exited the building, the city felt heavier but clearer. Daniel's suggestion echoed in his mind. Dual structures, internal versus filed. The trap was not just in the contracts themselves, it was in the system that hid behind them. But for now, Chapter 2 closed where it began. In analysis, in skepticism, in the tightening realization that beneath polished language lay deliberate design. The court had not shifted yet. Judge Whitman's doubt remained intact, and Marcus Whitfield understood that to dismantle the contract trap, he would need more than interpretation. He would need undeniable evidence. The industrial outskirts of Atlanta looked different after sunset. The skyline of downtown faded into a distant glow, replaced by long stretches of highway, low warehouses, and the steady hum of machinery that never seemed to sleep. Sodium streetlights cast amber pools across cracked asphalt, and the air carried a faint metallic scent mixed with diesel. Marcus Whitfield parked his car 2 blocks away from the coal manufacturing. He wore a dark overcoat over his suit, the collar turned slightly up against the evening wind. The factory loomed ahead, an enormous gray structure of steel and concrete. Its loading docks lit harshly, trucks lined like silent sentries. He had chosen the hour carefully. Shift change. Workers began filtering out in small clusters, steel-toed boots scraping pavement, reflective vests glowing briefly beneath the lights. Most walked quickly, heads down, conversations muted. Fatigue clung to them like a second uniform. James Carter stood near the employee entrance, shoulders tense. His broad frame seemed heavier tonight. He had called Marcus earlier with quiet urgency. "They're asking questions," James had said over the phone. "Supervisor pulled me aside, said I'm creating noise." Now, under the dim parking lot lights, James explained further. "They didn't say I'd be fired. Just that contracts get reviewed, and sometimes not renewed." Marcus studied his client's face. The fear was sharper now. "That's intimidation," Marcus said calmly, "but you are not alone." James nodded, though the word alone still lingered in his posture. A small group of workers stood nearby, hesitant. Among them was Liam Johnson. Liam was 24, slim and slightly taller than average, with medium brown skin and short twists framing his forehead. His eyes were bright but uncertain. He wore a faded work jacket zipped halfway and carried his lunchbox tightly against his chest. Youth clung to him. So did caution. Liam had grown up in a single-parent household in Decatur. His mother, a nurse, had raised him with strict discipline after his older brother had been incarcerated for a nonviolent offense. That experience had shaped Liam's deep aversion to confrontation. Stability mattered more to him than principle. Until now. James gestured toward Marcus. "This is him." Liam shifted uneasily. "I can't lose this job," he said before Marcus even spoke. Marcus stepped forward, his tone measured. "I'm not asking you to risk everything blindly. I'm asking you to tell the truth if you choose to." Liam looked down at the pavement. "They told us the contracts are normal, that it's how big companies work. Did anyone explain why you've signed 6 of them in 2 years?" Marcus asked. Silence. Another worker approached slowly. a woman in her late 30s with braided hair pulled back into a tight bun. Her name was Renee Carter, no relation to James. Renee had a strong, upright posture and steady gaze. Her deep brown skin was marked faintly by old burn scars along one forearm, reminders of a machine malfunction years ago. She carried herself with quiet strength. As a single mother of 2, she had learned to endure long shifts without complaint. "They keep 2 files," Renee said quietly. "I've seen it." Marcus's attention sharpened. "In HR," she continued. "One set in the drawer, another set locked." James inhaled sharply. "You're sure?" Renee nodded once. They filed different versions. Marcus felt the pieces aligning. A third worker stepped forward reluctantly. An older man named Victor Hale. Victor was in his early 50s, tall but slightly hunched, his gray-streaked beard trimmed short. His weathered face suggested decades of labor. Victor rarely spoke, but when he did, his voice carried weight. He had once worked union jobs in Alabama before factories shut down. That history had left him skeptical of management promises. "I was called into a meeting last month," Victor said. "They said short-term contracts keep us competitive. Said long-term classification raises costs." "Did they say it directly?" Marcus asked. Victor hesitated. "They record everything in meetings, but there was one meeting. Doors closed. No phones allowed." Liam swallowed. Except they forgot one. The 3 exchanged glances. Marcus remained silent, allowing the tension to settle. Liam's fingers tightened around his lunchbox. "I kept mine in my jacket. Audio only. Didn't think I'd use it." James stared at him. "You recorded it." Liam nodded faintly. "They were talking about reducing payroll obligations. Said if contracts reset every quarter, no one qualifies for benefits. Said regulators look at filings, not faces." Marcus exhaled slowly. "Do you still have it?" "Yes." The weight of the moment was undeniable, but fear moved just as strongly. Headlights flashed across the lot as a security vehicle drove past. A tall man stepped out near the loading dock. Derek Miles, the factory's floor supervisor. Derek was in his early 40s, muscular with closely shaved hair and a trimmed goatee. His eyes were sharp and constantly scanning. He wore a company-branded jacket zipped to his neck, posture rigid. He was known among workers for enforcing management decisions without hesitation. Derek's gaze lingered on the small gathering. James's shoulders stiffened. "He's been watching me," James murmured. Marcus stepped slightly forward, positioning himself in plain sight. Derek observed, but did not approach. The tension thickened. Eventually, the supervisor returned to his vehicle. Liam's voice trembled slightly. "If they find out..." Marcus looked at each of them in turn. "No decision tonight is final, but if you choose to stand, you will not stand alone. Protection exists under law. Retaliation strengthens our case." Renee nodded first. "I'll testify." Victor followed. "So will I." All eyes shifted to Liam. The wind moved through the lot, rattling loose metal against a fence. Liam lifted his chin slightly. "I'll do it." Marcus felt the shift, not just legal, but moral. Later that night, in the quiet of his office, Marcus listened to the audio file. The recording was imperfect. Background noise, distant machinery. But the voices were clear enough. A senior executive spoke confidently. "Keep contracts at 90 days. Reset before eligibility thresholds. It's cost-effective. Benefits are a liability." Another voice added, "Report active headcount quarterly, not cumulative." Marcus paused the playback. 2 systems, 2 records. The following afternoon, he requested limited document disclosure tied to employment classification. Though the court had not yet compelled production, he needed to verify what Renee had described. That evening, as Marcus prepared notes, his phone vibrated with an unfamiliar number. Unknown. Sender, "You're pushing beyond your reach. Don't go too far. The message was brief. No signature, no further explanation. Marcus read it twice. Threats rarely arrived loudly. They arrived as suggestions. He deleted nothing. He documented everything. Meanwhile, at home, Elena noticed Marcus's silence over dinner. Naomi watched him closely. "Did something happen?" Elena asked gently. Marcus set down his fork. "Pressure," he answered simply. Elena reached across the table, placing her hand over his. "You expected that?" "Yes," he replied, "but expecting it doesn't make it smaller." Naomi listened, absorbing more than either parent realized. The next morning, Marcus met privately with Renee, Victor, and Liam at a small community center off Cascade Road. The building was modest. Brick exterior, fluorescent lighting, folding chairs. They signed preliminary witness statements. Marcus explained protections carefully. Liam's signature trembled slightly on the page. "You sure?" Marcus asked him quietly. Liam nodded. "If they can do this to us, they'll do it to everyone." Outside, the sky was overcast again, as though Atlanta itself was holding its breath. James called shortly after. "They moved me to a different line," he said it's temporary. Marcus recognized the tactic. Isolation. "Document everything," he instructed. By the end of the week, Marcus had enough to confirm what Daniel Brooks had implied. There were indeed 2 sets of contractual documentation. One circulated internally to workers, another adjusted for compliance presentation. The language varied subtly but meaningfully. One obligated reset cycles, the other referenced project-based seasonal fluctuation. Carefully disguised, carefully deliberate. Marcus compiled the findings without yet presenting them to court. The time for exposure would come, but not prematurely. As night settled again over Atlanta's industrial edge, the factory lights burned steadily, unaware that the walls which had shielded internal strategy were beginning to thin. Chapter 3. Closed not in the courtroom, but in the parking lot where courage first outweighed fear. 3 workers had chosen truth. 2 contract systems had been identified. 1 recording now existed. And somewhere, behind closed office doors, executives remained unaware that their cost-saving strategy had been quietly captured. The battle inside the factory walls had begun. The rain had cleared by midweek, leaving Atlanta washed and sharp beneath a bright autumn sun. The skyline shimmered in the distance, but Marcus Whitfield's focus was far from downtown glass towers. He sat in his office long before sunrise, reviewing a digital file that had arrived late the night before through an encrypted link forwarded anonymously from a restricted account. The video was short, less than 4 minutes, but its implications were heavy. Marcus pressed play again. The footage showed Richard Cole seated in a private dining room at an upscale steakhouse in Buckhead. The room's lighting was low and warm, polished wood panels lining the walls. Richard Cole, in his early 50s, broad-shouldered and confident as ever, wore a navy-tailored suit. His silver-threaded hair was neatly combed back. His movements were controlled, deliberate. Across from him sat a man Marcus did not immediately recognize. The second man appeared to be in his late 40s, lean, with thinning dark hair and narrow features. His name, according to attached metadata, was Gregory Shaw, an officer with the Regional Tax Compliance Bureau. Shaw's posture was slightly hunched, his eyes darting subtly as he spoke. He wore a conservative gray suit, the kind designed not to attract attention. Halfway through the clip, Cole slid a thick envelope across the table. Shaw's hand rested on it briefly before slipping it into his briefcase. There was no handshake, no overt acknowledgement. Only a brief nod exchanged between 2 men who understood the language of silence. Marcus paused the video. His jaw tightened, though his breathing remained steady. This was not inference. This was intent. He leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled beneath his chin. The dual contracts and the audio recording from the factory meeting had exposed internal strategy. This footage exposed protection, external shielding from regulatory consequence. The hidden ledger was not on paper. It was in favors and envelopes. He opened his legal notebook and began mapping strategy. He would need to establish authentication of the video, source chain, verification of date and location, confirmation of identities. He would introduce it not as accusation, but as corroboration. It had to be positioned precisely. Too aggressive, and Judge Whitman might restrict admissibility. Too cautious, and its impact would dull. Marcus had learned long ago that truth alone does not win cases. Structure does. Later that morning, he stepped outside onto the small balcony of his office building. The air carried the faint scent of roasted coffee from a nearby cafe. Traffic below moved in steady rhythm. He thought briefly of the text message he had received days earlier, warning him not to go too far. He smiled faintly. He had already crossed that line. That evening at home, Elena noticed the shift in his expression the moment he walked through the door. She was setting plates on the dining table, her movements fluid and measured. Elena Whitfield carried quiet strength in everything she did. Tall and slender, with graceful posture and thoughtful brown eyes, she had always possessed a presence that steadied others. Years ago, when she first began teaching history, she had been mistaken repeatedly for administrative staff. Those early humiliations had not embittered her. They had sharpened her conviction that dignity must be defended calmly, not loudly. "You found something," she said softly. Marcus removed his coat and nodded once. Proof of coordination, not just internal manipulation. Elena studied his face carefully. "This isn't just about contracts anymore, is it?" "No." She stepped closer, placing her hands gently against his chest. "Then remember what you're fighting for. Not just James, not just those workers. You're fighting for how our community is seen, for every time someone assumed you didn't belong at that table." Marcus's eyes softened slightly. He had not told her yet about the memory that resurfaced earlier that day, his final interview at a prestigious Atlanta law firm 15 years ago. He had been 23 then, freshly graduated, top of his class. The hiring partner, a tall white man with silver-rimmed glasses, had scanned Marcus's resume before smiling politely. "You're impressive," the partner had said, "but we're looking for someone who fits our firm culture." Marcus had understood the coded language immediately. Not a cultural fit. He had walked out that day determined never to beg for a seat again. He would build his own table. Now, years later, that same determination returned with sharper clarity. At school the following afternoon, Naomi Whitfield stood at the front of her 7th grade classroom holding note cards in both hands. She wore a navy sweater and dark jeans, her hair pulled back neatly. Though only 12, Naomi possessed a composed presence beyond her years. She had chosen to present on the theme of justice and moral courage. Her teacher, Mrs. Lillian Grant, stood to the side observing proudly. Mrs. Grant was in her early 50s, petite with short silver curls and warm brown eyes behind thin spectacles. She had taught in Atlanta public schools for nearly 3 decades and believed deeply in shaping young voices. Naomi cleared her throat. "Justice," she began, "is not automatic. It requires someone willing to speak when others stay silent." She did not mention her father by name. She did not need to. In history, she continued, progress only happened because ordinary people chose courage over fear. Her classmates listened quietly. One boy in the back, Tyler Matthews, tall and restless, often dismissive, sat unusually still. Tyler had once joked that lawsuits were just about money. Today, Naomi's voice carried something different. When she finished, there was brief silence before applause. Mrs. Grant nodded approvingly. "Well said." Naomi sat down, heart racing. For the first time, she understood that courage was not always dramatic. Sometimes it was steady. That night, Marcus reviewed the video again with a trusted colleague, Professor Henry Caldwell, a retired constitutional law scholar who occasionally advised him. Caldwell was in his early 70s, thin and slightly stooped, with white hair combed neatly back and sharp hazel eyes that missed little. He had marched for civil rights as a young man and carried that history quietly within him. "This is significant," Caldwell said after watching, "but you must anchor it. Establish relevance directly to the employment practices. Avoid appearing sensational." "I know," Marcus replied. "It ties to reporting discrepancies." Caldwell nodded slowly. "Then you don't attack. You reveal." Marcus appreciated the distinction. Attack invites defense. Revelation invites reflection. The following morning, Marcus began drafting his evidentiary motion. He structured it meticulously. Dual contracts, audio recording of executive meeting, employment underreporting, and now visual corroboration of improper influence. Each piece supported the next. He paused briefly before writing the final line of his summary. The pattern demonstrates deliberate evasion, not administrative oversight. He read it twice. Outside his office window, the city moved as it always had. Cars flowing, pedestrians crossing, unaware of the quiet war unfolding in documents and digital files. At dinner that evening, Naomi spoke excitedly about her presentation. Elena listened with pride. Marcus smiled, but his thoughts remained disciplined. "You did good?" he asked gently. Naomi nodded. "I said justice needs someone brave." Marcus held her gaze. "That's true." Later, after the house had grown quiet, he stood alone by the living room window. Atlanta's distant lights shimmered faintly beyond the trees. He thought again of the firm that had once rejected him, of the subtle smirks in court, of Judge Whitman's restrained skepticism. He did not feel anger. He felt clarity. This case was no longer simply about short-term contracts. It was about whether systems could manipulate legality behind closed doors while presenting compliance in public. The hidden ledger was not just financial, it was moral. Marcus closed his laptop carefully. He would introduce the video at the precise moment. Supported, authenticated, undeniable. Not yet, but soon. For now, Chapter 4 closed with evidence secured, strategy sharpened, and resolve strengthened. The envelope had been passed in a quiet restaurant, but its echo would soon reach a courtroom. The morning air over downtown Atlanta felt sharper than usual, crisp and bright as sunlight reflected off the courthouse windows. News vans once again lined the curb outside Fulton County Courthouse, but this time the atmosphere was different. There was anticipation in the air, a subtle shift in tone among reporters who had spent days debating whether Marcus Whitfield was building toward something substantial or merely circling speculation. Inside the courtroom, the wooden benches filled earlier than usual. Observers leaned forward in quiet expectation. Even the usual low murmur felt restrained, as if the room sensed that something decisive was about to unfold. Marcus stood at his table, posture straight, navy suit perfectly pressed, his expression calm but focused. His eyes held none of the fatigue from previous days. If anything, there was clarity, like a man who had finally reached the point where preparation met opportunity. Across the aisle sat Richard Cole. Today, Cole appeared less composed than usual. Though still dressed impeccably in a charcoal suit with a silk tie, his jaw tightened repeatedly, and he tapped his fingers against the table in short, impatient rhythms. His normally controlled demeanor showed faint cracks. Power, when threatened, rarely stays quiet. Thomas Reynolds, his attorney, leaned toward him occasionally, whispering reassurances. Reynolds's narrow eyes scanned Marcus carefully, trying to anticipate his next move. Judge Harold Whitman entered with the same authoritative stride, yet even his posture carried a trace of alertness that had not been present before. He adjusted his robe and surveyed the room. "Proceed, Mr. Whitfield." Marcus rose slowly. "Your Honor, members of the jury, Today, I present corroborated evidence supporting the claim that coal manufacturing systematically manipulated employment classifications to evade lawful obligations. He began with the contracts. 2 folders were placed before the court clerk. The first contained the version signed by workers, 3-month renewable agreements clearly labeling employees as temporary without benefits eligibility. The second, obtained through disclosure and corroborated by testimony, contained a filing template submitted to regulatory agencies, describing the workforce as project-based seasonal fluctuation personnel. Marcus walked the jury through the language differences carefully, his tone even and precise. "Notice the structural reset clause here," he said, pointing. "Now compare it to the reporting statement here. One describes indefinite cycling, the other implies short-term seasonal staffing." The jurors leaned forward. One juror in particular, a middle-aged black woman named Lorraine Edwards, tall and dignified with short natural hair and observant eyes, tilted her head slightly, studying the documents with focused intensity. Lorraine had spent 20 years as a school administrator and carried an instinct for recognizing inconsistency. Her expression shifted subtly. Reynolds objected to the interpretation. Judge Whitman allowed Marcus to continue within limits. Then Marcus introduced the audio recording. The courtroom grew still as the playback began. The faint hum of machinery filtered through the recording, followed by a clear executive voice. "Keep contracts at 90 days. Reset before eligibility thresholds. Benefits increase overhead." The words echoed against the courtroom's wooden walls. Another voice. "Regulators review filings, not operational cycles." Silence followed. Marcus stopped the recording. "This demonstrates deliberate strategy," he stated calmly. Richard Cole shifted abruptly in his seat. His hand clenched into a fist. The confident executive who once sat relaxed now leaned forward with visible agitation. Reynolds rose sharply. "Your Honor, we challenge the authenticity." Marcus was prepared. He presented verification documentation, device ownership, timestamp confirmation, expert validation of unaltered audio structure. He had anticipated resistance. Judge Whitman examined the supporting paperwork longer than usual. After a pause that seemed to stretch across the room, he nodded once. "The recording will be admitted." A ripple moved through the gallery, but Marcus was not finished. He turned toward the clerk. "Your Honor, I request permission to present a visual exhibit." Whitman hesitated briefly. "Proceed." The courtroom lights dimmed slightly as the video screen flickered to life. The footage showed Richard Cole seated in the private restaurant room, envelope sliding across polished wood toward Gregory Shaw, the tax compliance officer. There was no dramatic music, no raised voices, only the quiet choreography of influence. Gasps were audible. Richard Cole's composure finally broke. "This is absurd," he muttered under his breath, though loud enough for nearby reporters to hear. His face reddened, jaw tightening visibly. For a man accustomed to control, public exposure was unfamiliar terrain. Reynolds stood again. "Your Honor, this is circumstantial." Marcus spoke firmly but respectfully. "The footage aligns with the pattern of underreported workforce data and the internal strategy revealed in the audio recording." Judge Whitman's gaze moved slowly from the screen to Richard Cole, then to Marcus. For the first time since the trial began, there was no interruption. "The video will be shown in full," Whitman ruled. The silence that followed felt different than previous days. It was no longer skepticism. It was recalibration. Jurors exchanged glances. Lorraine Edwards folded her hands deliberately, her expression firm. Another juror, a young white man in his late 20s named Michael Turner, tall with sandy hair and thoughtful blue eyes, who had earlier appeared uncertain, now stared directly at the screen with visible concern. Michael worked as an accountant. Discrepancies in reporting did not sit lightly with him. The weight of evidence had shifted perception. James Carter was called back to the stand for clarification regarding contract renewals. This time, he walked forward differently. His shoulders were squared, his steps steady. He still wore the same borrowed suit, but something about him had changed. Fear had loosened its grip. "Mr. Carter," Marcus asked gently, "did you ever receive explanation for why your contract was reset every 90 days?" "No," James answered clearly. "Just told it was policy." "And were you informed that filings described your position as seasonal?" James blinked in visible confusion. "Seasonal? I've worked there year-round." A murmur moved through the room. James stood taller now, voice firm. "They told us we were replaceable, but we weren't temporary. We were permanent without protection." The words hung in the air. Even Judge Whitman's posture softened slightly. Outside the courthouse, reporters updated headlines in real time. The tone had shifted from skepticism to intrigue. Whitfield presents compelling evidence. Corporate practices under scrutiny. Back inside, Marcus concluded the day's presentation without theatrics. He did not raise his voice. He did not gloat. He simply organized the evidence into a coherent narrative. 2 contracts, 1 strategy, 1 envelope. Richard Cole leaned back in his chair, visibly shaken. The polished executive persona had eroded. His breathing appeared heavier. At one point, he whispered sharply to Reynolds, frustration overtaking caution. Judge Whitman called for order when murmurs grew too loud. As court recessed, the jurors exited with expressions no longer dismissive, but contemplative. Marcus gathered his files slowly. James approached him quietly. "They heard it," James said. "Yes," Marcus replied. For the first time since the trial began, the courtroom glare had dimmed. The turning point was not explosive. It was deliberate. Evidence layered upon evidence until doubt no longer held center stage. As the room emptied, sunlight streamed through the tall courthouse windows, illuminating dust particles drifting in quiet suspension. The atmosphere felt altered. Judge Whitman remained seated longer than usual, reviewing the documents again. He did not speak further, but his earlier skepticism had been replaced by something else: recognition. Chapter 5. Closed, not with a verdict, but with balance restored inside a room that had once leaned unevenly. The evidence had been admitted. The silence now carried weight, and the eyes that once questioned Marcus Whitfield now measured him differently. The courtroom felt different that morning. Not louder, not more crowded, but steadier. Sunlight streamed cleanly through the tall arched windows of the Fulton County Courthouse, casting long bands of gold across the polished wooden floor. The tension that once pressed against the walls had thinned, replaced by a focused stillness. Everyone understood that this was the day words would weigh as much as evidence. Marcus Whitfield stood at his table, hands resting lightly on the edge, shoulders squared. He wore the same navy suit, but it no longer felt like armor. It felt like alignment. His posture was relaxed, yet grounded, as if every breath had been measured in preparation for this moment. Across the room, Richard Cole appeared diminished. His earlier frustration had cooled into something quieter, tight-lipped restraint. His broad frame seemed heavier in the chair. Thomas Reynolds sat beside him, reviewing notes rapidly, but even his sharp confidence had dulled. Judge Harold Whitman entered with deliberate composure. He took his seat, adjusted his glasses, and glanced briefly toward Marcus before addressing the court. Closing arguments. Marcus rose. He did not approach the jury immediately. Instead, he allowed a moment of silence to settle, a pause that invited attention without demanding it. "Members of the jury," he began, his voice firm but calm. "This case is not about technicalities. It is not about whether language in a contract can be interpreted 2 ways. It is about intention." He walked slowly toward the jury box. "We have seen 2 contracts, one for workers, one for filings. We have heard executives discuss resetting obligations before employees qualify for benefits. We have watched a quiet exchange meant to protect a system from scrutiny. He paused, allowing the sequence to breathe in their minds. Justice does not belong to one race. It does not belong to wealth. It does not bend for convenience. The law exists so that power cannot silence those who build with their hands what others profit from. His voice remained controlled, but there was steel beneath it. James Carter worked year-round. He was called temporary. He was told he was replaceable. Yet the evidence shows deliberate design, not oversight. Design. Marcus's gaze moved briefly toward Richard Cole, then returned to the jury. When systems manipulate definitions to avoid responsibility, the harm is not abstract. It is personal. It is healthcare denied, stability withheld, dignity discounted. He inhaled slowly. The law cannot be manipulated by those who believe they are beyond it, and justice does not change its color depending on who stands before you. Silence followed. It was not dramatic. It was resolute. Marcus returned to his table without flourish. Thomas Reynolds delivered his closing with polished rhetoric, arguing procedural compliance and economic necessity. He suggested that competitive markets required flexible staffing models. He warned against over-interpreting administrative choices. But the air had shifted. The jury deliberated for hours. During that time, Marcus remained seated quietly, hands folded. James Carter sat beside him, his broad frame rigid with anticipation. His eyes moved between the courtroom doors and the bench repeatedly. James had changed since the first day of trial. The stooped uncertainty had straightened into something steadier. He wore the same suit, but now he carried it differently. The fear of retaliation still existed, but it no longer dominated his expression. In the gallery sat Renee Carter and Victor Hale. Renee's posture was upright, hands clasped firmly in her lap. Victor leaned slightly forward, weathered face intent. Liam Johnson sat near the back, shoulders tense but eyes focused. Elena Whitfield entered quietly during deliberations, taking a seat near the aisle. She wore a soft gray dress and carried herself with the same calm composure that had steadied Marcus from the beginning. She did not wave. She did not speak. She simply sat where he could see her. Naomi was not present. School would not excuse her again. But she had texted earlier. No matter what, you already won. After several hours, the bailiff entered. The bailiff, Martin Green, was a tall African-American man in his late 40s with a deep voice and measured demeanor. His shaved head and broad shoulders gave him an imposing presence, but those who knew him described him as gentle outside the courtroom. He announced that the jury had reached a verdict. The room stood. The jurors filed in. Lorraine Edwards held the verdict envelope. Her face was composed, but her eyes reflected gravity. Judge Whitman addressed her. "Has the jury reached a unanimous decision?" "Yes, Your Honor." The envelope was handed to the clerk. The words were read clearly. "We find that coal manufacturing violated state labor law through systematic misclassification of employees." A pause. "We further find that the company is required to compensate affected workers and provide full benefit coverage retroactively." Another pause, heavier. "We recommend that evidence regarding financial reporting discrepancies be referred for formal tax investigation." The silence lasted only a second before it broke. James Carter inhaled sharply, his hands trembling. Then the sound escaped him. A quiet sob he could not restrain. He covered his face briefly, shoulders shaking. Years of pressure, doubt, and humiliation released in a single moment. Renee placed a steady hand on his back. Victor Hale nodded slowly, eyes glistening. Liam Johnson exhaled deeply, tension draining from his frame. A soft ripple of applause began in the gallery, hesitant at first, then stronger. Judge Whitman lifted his gavel lightly but did not strike it immediately. Order returned quickly. Richard Cole stared straight ahead, jaw set, expression unreadable. Thomas Reynolds whispered urgently, already calculating appeals. Judge Whitman cleared his throat. "Mr. Whitfield?" Marcus stood. The judge removed his glasses slowly. "This court acknowledges the thoroughness of your presentation. I must also address my earlier conduct." He paused, the weight of his words evident. "In the interest of impartiality, I recognize that I allowed skepticism to appear personal. That was improper. The court apologizes." The statement was brief, but its impact was unmistakable. Marcus inclined his head respectfully. "Thank you, Your Honor." There was no triumph in his face, only acknowledgement. As the courtroom emptied gradually, reporters moved quickly to update headlines. Outside, cameras flashed. The narrative had shifted completely now. Inside, James approached Marcus again, tears still visible along his cheeks. "I didn't think they'd listen," James said quietly. "They listened because you stood," Marcus replied. Renee joined them, her expression steady but relieved. "It's not just him," she said. "It's all of us." Marcus nodded. His phone vibrated softly in his pocket. A message from Daniel Brooks. "Well done." Truth carried weight. Marcus allowed himself a small smile. He stepped outside briefly into the bright afternoon sun. Atlanta hummed as always. Cars passing, people moving, life continuing without pause. But for many inside that courthouse, something had shifted permanently. Elena joined him on the steps. "You spoke clearly," she said. "I spoke honestly," Marcus replied. She reached for his hand. Behind them, workers exited the courthouse in small clusters. Some shook hands, some embraced. The applause that had begun inside echoed faintly in memory. Justice had been spoken. Not loudly, not theatrically, but clearly. Chapter 6 closed with no ambiguity left in the air. The company had been found in violation. Compensation would follow. Insurance coverage would be restored. An investigation into tax practices would begin. And in a courtroom once clouded by doubt, acknowledgement had replaced assumption. Autumn had deepened over Atlanta by the time the leaves began to turn amber along Peachtree Street. The sharp tension that once surrounded Fulton County Courthouse had softened into routine movement. Lawyers entering briskly, clerks carrying files, the steady rhythm of a city continuing forward. Months had passed since the verdict, but the echoes of that courtroom still carried in quiet ways. Coal manufacturing no longer looked the same. The factory on the outskirts of the city had undergone visible restructuring. The company logo remained, but inside, policy binders had been rewritten. Human resources offices, once guarded spaces, were now lined with transparent glass panels. New compliance posters hung in break rooms. Contract templates had changed. Workers signed full-year agreements with health benefits clearly outlined. Insurance enrollment sessions were held openly in the cafeteria. James Carter stood near one of the production lines one afternoon, clipboard in hand. His posture was different now. Not stiff with fear, but upright with authority. He had been promoted to shift supervisor after the restructuring process began. At 45, with strong shoulders and steady eyes, he carried leadership quietly. The lines around his face no longer reflected uncertainty, but responsibility. He wore a clean navy work shirt embroidered with Operations Lead. The title had not been handed easily. Management needed someone trusted by workers and credible in the aftermath of investigation. James had become that bridge. Renee Carter continued working beside him, though her demeanor was lighter. Victor Hale remained skeptical of corporate promises, but admitted the changes were real. Liam Johnson, now more confident, had enrolled in evening classes at a local community college, studying business administration. Fear had been replaced by direction. Outside the factory, regulatory audits had followed through. Gregory Shaw, the tax officer seen in the video, had quietly resigned pending investigation. The hidden ledger was no longer hidden. Downtown, Marcus Whitfield sat in a modest lecture hall at Atlanta Law School, invited as a guest speaker. The school's dean, Professor Margaret Holloway, had personally extended the invitation. Margaret Holloway was a distinguished woman in her early 60s with silver-streaked hair cut neatly at chin length. Tall and slender, she carried an academic grace that commanded attention without intimidation. Decades earlier, she had been one of the first women of color to hold tenure at the institution. Her voice was calm but firm, shaped by years of navigating systems that did not easily open. "We believe practical advocacy should be taught by those who live it," she had told Marcus when inviting him. The lecture hall was filled with second- and third-year law students, notebooks open. Marcus stood at the podium, hands resting lightly against the wood. He did not recount the entire trial. Instead, he spoke about structure, patience, and the discipline of preparation. "Justice," he told the students, "rarely arrives in dramatic fashion. It is built in layers. Fact by fact, voice by voice. If you rely on outrage alone, you lose. If you rely on evidence, you endure." Students leaned forward. A young woman in the front row, named Alyssa Grant, raised her hand. Alyssa was in her early 20s, tall and lean with natural curls pulled back loosely. She had grown up in rural Georgia and was the first in her family to attend law school. "Did you ever feel," she asked carefully, "that you were being judged before you even spoke?" Marcus smiled faintly. "Yes," he said simply, "but judgment is noise. Preparation is clarity." The room absorbed the weight of that. After the lecture, Professor Holloway approached him. "We would like to offer you an adjunct position next semester," she said. "Employment law." Marcus accepted with quiet gratitude. Across town, Elena Whitfield adjusted the collar of her coat as she and Marcus walked, hand in hand, along the Beltline one cool evening. 15 years of marriage had deepened their rhythm rather than dulled it. Elena's presence remained steady, her brown eyes reflecting the city lights as they flickered along the path. They had chosen a small restaurant overlooking Piedmont Park to celebrate their anniversary. No cameras, no headlines, just quiet acknowledgement of years shared. "You never doubted," Marcus said as they sat across from each other. "I worried," Elena corrected gently. "But I never doubted." Her belief had never been loud. It had been constant. They toasted not only the victory in court, but the endurance behind it. At school, Naomi Whitfield stood in the hallway between classes, her backpack slung over one shoulder. Her friend Maya Thompson, a tall, bright-eyed girl with braided hair and infectious laughter, leaned toward her excitedly. "Is it true?" Maya asked. "Your dad's case changed company policy?" Naomi nodded, trying not to smile too widely. "My dad says it was all over the news," Maya continued. Naomi lifted her chin slightly. "He's a lawyer who protects people who don't have a voice." The words felt natural now, not boastful. True. In courtrooms across Atlanta, Judge Harold Whitman's demeanor had shifted subtly but noticeably. He still carried authority, still maintained order, but his interruptions had softened. He listened longer before speaking. His tone held less edge when younger attorneys rose to argue. Clerks whispered that he had reflected deeply after the coal manufacturing trial. Whatever the reason, his bench felt steadier. One afternoon, Marcus happened to appear before him on a smaller case, an unrelated dispute involving housing rights. When Marcus concluded his argument, Whitman nodded once. "Thank you, Mr. Whitfield," the judge said evenly. Clear and precise as always. The acknowledgement was brief but genuine. Outside the courthouse later that week, Marcus stood alone for a moment on the wide stone steps. The air was warm, sunlight soft against his face. Traffic moved steadily along the street, people passing without recognizing him. He looked up at the courthouse columns, remembering the glare of the first day. the skepticism, the interruptions, the weight of assumption. He did not feel triumph. He felt perspective. This victory had never belonged solely to him. It belonged to James Carter, who chose to stand despite fear. To Renee, Victor, and Liam, who risked stability for truth. To Elena, whose quiet strength never wavered. To Naomi, who learned that courage can be calm. A voice called his name from behind. It was Daniel Brooks, walking briskly across the plaza. Daniel still wore corporate suits, though his posture seemed lighter. "I wanted to say congratulations again," he said, "and thank you. Your case pushed more companies to review internal practices." Marcus shook his hand. Change rarely announces itself loudly. Daniel nodded. But it moves. Weeks later, Marcus received a formal letter from the Georgia Workers' Advocacy Alliance, a nonprofit organization dedicated to labor rights reform. The letter invited him to serve as a legal advisor on policy reform initiatives. The organization's director, Sandra Mitchell, signed it personally. Sandra was in her late 40s, medium height with close-cropped hair and sharp, attentive eyes. Her career had been shaped by witnessing her own mother lose employment benefits in the early 1990s due to contractual loopholes. That history fueled her relentless commitment to reform. Marcus accepted the advisory role. He did not seek spotlight. He sought continuity. One late afternoon, as sunlight dipped low over Atlanta, casting golden hues against the courthouse facade, Marcus paused once more at the base of the steps. He knew the headlines would fade. He knew new cases would rise. But he also knew something had shifted, not only in policy but in perception. Justice required persistence. Ability was never defined by color, and one person's courage could open a path wide enough for many to walk through. The wind moved gently across the plaza. Marcus Whitfield stood quietly, understanding that the victory was never his alone. It belonged to everyone who had once been underestimated, and refused to remain that way. This story reminds us that justice does not happen by accident. It happens because someone chooses to stand when it would be easier to sit down. In daily life, we may not stand in a courtroom, but we face moments where silence protects comfort and courage protects people. The lesson is simple. Integrity matters. Preparation matters. Character matters. We learn that discrimination does not always shout. Sometimes it appears as doubt, as dismissal, as quiet bias. The answer is not anger without direction, but strength guided by wisdom. Education gives us tools. Discipline gives us stability. Faith gives us endurance. In our workplaces, schools, and communities, we must treat people with fairness and respect. Black or white, rich or poor, every person deserves dignity. When we see injustice, we should not look away. When we see someone underestimated, we should not join the crowd. True leadership begins with small daily choices. Let this story challenge us to examine ourselves. Do we judge too quickly? Do we listen carefully? Do we use our voice to protect others? Change in society begins with change in the heart. If this message touched you, share it with someone who needs encouragement. Leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from. Subscribe to the channel so we can continue telling stories that inspire courage and fairness. May God bless you and your family with strength, wisdom, and peace. If you believe that justice and faith still matter in this world, write Amen in the comments.